I wanted to ask you a question, but you preempted me. We were talking about how you were born in India, how you have traveled the world, how you grew up with scientist parents, but you derailed my question, which was supposed to be profound, about the impact on your impression on death, to tell me you went to an all-Catholic girls' school.
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, it started off as a co-ed school. It was the only English school in town. And then...
This is in India?
In India. And it was...
Southern India? I'm sorry.
No, my parents were from the south, and they'd moved to Gujarat, where they didn't speak the language. I didn't speak the language. So they sent me to an English school. And the only English school was run by Catholic nuns, and it was a co-ed school. Then when I was in 3rd grade, a Jesuit school opened up an English school for boys. So the nun said, there's an alternative for boys now, so we're not going to take any boys anymore. So from 3rd grade on, no new boys were allowed to enroll in our school, but boys would leave. Their parents would move, or they'd flunk out or something. But new girls kept coming in. And so by the time I graduated, 3 grades below me, it was all girls. And my own class was like 4 to 1 girls to boys, you know, the ratio. So I didn't know how good I had it at that time. But,
Well, you've traveled the world, and yet, despite having experience with Hinduism, Buddhism, Catholicism, you still describe your attitude towards death as that of a rational scientist.
Yeah.
I want to preempt anyone's aspirations that we're going to get spiritual here.
You know, so, sometimes I joke that I self-identify as a white Victorian gentleman scientist, you know, because one of my heroes is Charles Darwin, so I think of myself as a Darwinist, and you know, so very, very rational, I think.
And yet you have this interest. When in your book you discuss how pervasive it is culturally for people to rail against the finality of death. And there are these sort of plans people have for how to resist.
It is true. I mean, if you look at human culture, so much of it has been driven by the fact that we're aware of our mortality. And I like to think, you know, I point out that we may be the only species that's aware of mortality. Animals may be aware of death. In fact, there's going to be a book that may have come out already about how animals perceive death. It's called Playing Possum, I think. But I don't think animals, there's no evidence that they know that they have an expiration date on them.
It's the inevitability they don't know.
The inevitability and the finiteness of that lifespan, they don't know. Humans know about it because of language and our ability to generalize and pass on information to our children and so on. And that's driven human culture. For example, if you look at all religions, they all view death as a transition of one sort or another. For example, the Abrahamic religions from the Middle East believed that you would be corporeally resurrected at some point in time. So they traditionally insisted on burial. Cremation was considered a no-no. And similarly, if you look at Eastern religions, they believe that, oh, well, your body may decay, but you have an immortal soul that will occupy some new body or eventually achieve nirvana. And the Egyptians somehow conflated everything. They had corporeal resurrection, which is why you had mummification of the pharaohs, but they also believed in this immortal soul, which they called Ba or something. So, you know, that's been the case ever since human. And if you look at how we, you know, talk about death even now, very few people say, you know, my father died. They say, oh, my father passed on or passed away, or things like that.
And do you think that there was any adaptive value? You describe it as somewhat of an evolutionary accident that we're aware of the inevitability of death. Do you think there was adaptive value, or did it simply come along with everything else, language, consciousness, self-awareness?
I think more likely the latter. I think we simply happened to, as we evolved, you know, larger brains and language and ability to generalize and also ability to disseminate information in a systematic way through language, when we started realizing that, oh, everybody's dying, And so this means that it's inevitable. We passed on that idea, and I think we've been, we don't live in terror of death. I mean, we all act in our daily lives as though we're immortal. But deep down, that knowledge of our mortality does affect us, and it has an impact.
And as you said, this is Greenwood Cemetery, which is in our sort of Brooklyn neighborhood, and we collaborate with Greenwood sometimes. In these Abrahamic religions, they still thought, maybe the body's important, so let's bury it whole. And that's why cremation is part of the Hinduist philosophy, right? And the idea that reincarnation means the body's just, it's
the body
okay to
is
let
not
it go.
relevant anymore once it's died.
Right. Do you think that even our awareness of death, so maybe it's not adaptive, it's just incidental, but do you think it drove some of these notions of the soul and the immortal
definitely.
soul?
I think the idea of a soul may well have come about as we thought of ways to escape death. Mm-hmm. I like to quote philosopher Stephen Cave's idea. Mm-hmm. He says that ever since we became aware of mortality, we evolved 4 strategies. One is not to die.
And we're going to talk about that later.
Try to avoid dying.
Yeah.
The other is, okay, you may die, but your body will be resurrected. So you'll come back as yourself, more or less. And a third is, well, maybe the body will decay, but you've got this immortal soul that will be perpetual, may occupy other bodies or escape into some infinite space. And then the fourth idea of immortality is you live on through something else, like your works or your monuments. If you're rich, if you're very talented, you live on through your works. If you're very rich, you live on through monuments or buildings named after you. And if you're neither, you still have the option of living on through your offspring. Mm-hmm. And so that's the 4 choices. But of course, it always boils down to choice A, because ultimately we know those other things aren't quite the same. And I think Woody Allen said, I don't want to live on in the hearts of my fans. I want to live on in my apartment. So that was it.
Well, let's take a slightly more scientific approach to the idea of death. Some biologists have said biology can only be understood through the lens of evolution. It's really the only way to understand anything about biology. Yeah. And so it's a fair question, why do we die? If evolution wants us to survive, right? If that's how you pass your genes on.
It's kind of paradox. And when Darwin proposed his natural selection theory, it wasn't really understood. It wasn't understood until the early 20th century. Actually, not even that early, in the sort of 30s. And, normally you would say, well, if the whole purpose, what evolution optimizes for is fitness, which is, in a biological sense, fitness means the ability to pass on your genes, the likelihood of being able to pass on your genes. So that's what evolution cares about, because it's selecting genes. It's really about if your genes survive, they're selected for. If they're not, if they don't survive, that's it. So you might think that the longer you live, the more likely you are to pass on your genes. And so you should be selecting for a long lifespan. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't work that way, and there's a reason for that. The reason is that in real life, resources are limited. So it's only recently that humans have solved the resource problem, and we now have, at least in developed countries, we have plenty of food, actually too much. But throughout most of our existence, and certainly for all other wild species, resources are limited. And so you have to make a trade-off. Do you spend those resources in maintenance and repair of the individual animal, and that takes energy and resources, or do you spend those resources in rapid growth and maturation in order to make sure that you have offspring? And the trade-off works differently depending on the animal. So for example, if you're a mouse, there's no point in a mouse having evolved to live for 40 years naturally, because in the wild, it would be eaten by a predator or die of starvation or drought or something long before that. So there, evolution has selected for a species that grows very rapidly and reproduces quickly. Now, if you're a large animal, take the other extreme, a Greenland shark or a bowhead whale, they live for...
A Greenland shark, you say?
That's right.
They're 400 years old.
so if you're that kind of animal, then the Greenland shark has extremely slow metabolism. It's also true that metabolism is faster in small animals and slower in large animals. There are some physical reasons for that. And so Greenland shark can live up to at least 700 years. There's a Greenland shark that's been dated that long, to live that long. And there, because it's a slower metabolism, it matures more slowly, etc., the equation's different. Now, one interesting example are bats. So bats are the same size as mice, but they live about 20 times as long. Why is that? Well, bats can fly around, and so they can escape predators much more easily. And they also can forage over a much wider area, so they're not as likely to starve. And also when they roost in the ceilings of caves, so they're also relatively immune to predators. And so bats can live 10 to 20 times as long as mice, because there it pays, because bats will live long and produce more offspring over a longer lifespan.
And the Galapagos tortoise is another example.
Galapagos tortoise is the same. It's slow metabolism. It's very well protected by its shell. It's not likely to be the subject of predation. And so there it lives longer. And I like to joke, Galapagos tortoises could live to be maybe 200 years, at least 170 is documented. And so there could be a Galapagos tortoise around today that encountered Darwin when he was visiting the Galapagos Islands.
Right. That's quite amazing. You make an analogy in the book between death and bankruptcy. You reference Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, and a character is asked, how did you go bankrupt? And the reply is 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly.
Yeah.
Is death like that?
I like to think so. So when we think of death, the death is really the end product of aging. So if you think of aging, what happens is that it's a gradual accumulation of defects at every level, from our molecules to the components in our cell, to cells, to tissues and organs, and then eventually the whole individual. And at every level, you're accumulating defects or changes. Some of them are not necessarily defects per se, they had a purpose. And so you get this accumulation, and it leads to gradual loss of function. And that's the gradual phase of bankruptcy. You're losing money, you're in negative revenue, and you're burning through your cash reserve. And that's the gradual phase. And then suddenly something comes to a head. For example, some critical system fails, like your brain or your heart or your kidney. And so the whole thing just can't work. And this gets to the definition of death. What do we mean by death? Well, while we're alive, millions of cells in us are constantly dying. In fact, many of them have to die for us to continue living. And the paradox is, at the moment of our death, most of our cells are still alive. So that's why you can donate organs to transplant recipients. But what we mean by death is the death of the individual, their ability to function as a whole individual.
And you were saying that even though we are living much longer than we used to back when we were on the savannah, that there's still a maximum age, it feels like, that hasn't moved. We were talking about, sorry, actually I'm going the wrong way because we got excited about the Greenland shark. We were talking about this woman who is purportedly...
That's John Calmon.
Yes, tell me about her.
She's a very colorful character. She lived to be...
Note she's smoking and drinking.
She was smoking, smoking. She had a cigarette and a glass of port every day after lunch. well into her, until she was over 100. And she used to bicycle, I think, until she was 100 or so. She lived to be 122. And one little anecdote about her, once she reached, say, 105 or something, reporters would gather around her house every anniversary, every birthday. And at one of them, a reporter said to her, "Well, see you next year, I hope." And she said, "Why not? You look pretty healthy to me." and she also, by the way, ate 2.5 pounds of chocolate. And I could get behind that.
Daily?
No, a week. Sorry, 2.5 pounds a week.
So it's interesting that we're living longer and we're healthier, but the maximum age hasn't moved that much.
Yeah, and we think that because she died in 1997, and since then, no one has lived over 120. And so, although our lifespan, you might say, it's not true that our lifespan has increased. What has increased is our life expectancy, which means what is the probability that you will reach that age when you're born? And our life expectancy has increased gradually it's doubled actually over the last 150 years. And that's because of improvements in sanitation, vaccines, no matter what the US government may think, and better nutrition, antibiotics. So a number of things helped and food supply, even things like the Haber process for fixing nitrogen has dramatically increased lifespan by improving food production. And so that's resulted in the doubling of life expectancy, because many of those, previously, people would die early in life, often in infancy or in childhood. So that's been gradually, not eliminated, but really dramatically reduced. But what hasn't increased is the maximum lifespan, and that's probably about 120 at the most. But even anybody over 110 is an extreme outlier. There are very, very few people who live that.
The super centenarians in some sense. So you have said nonetheless that there is something about us that is teetering towards the immortal. And what aspect is that of our biology that doesn't die?
Sure, there's a couple of things. So each of us came from a living cell, actually 2 living cells, one from our father and one from our mother. And each of those parents came from a pair of living cells. And you can go on all the way back to the very first cell. And that was a few billion years ago. So you can say that, we have not come out of nothing. Each cell has given rise to other cells, and so there's an element of us that goes all the way back to the beginning of the first cell. And so, in a sense, that cell lineage has been immortal, even though the body dies. And so there's a distinction, I call it the immortal gene and the disposable body. So what persists is information. The information on how to build an entire cell or an entire organism from a single cell, that has sort of persisted over time.
And it's quite stunning to think that we all share genetic information all the way back to the first multicellular organism billions of years ago.
Yeah, no question. I mean, even bacteria, there are lots of genes that we share with bacteria, and so that just shows you how, basic genes have been conserved all the way from bacteria to humans. For example, ribosomes, which translate the genetic information into proteins, and that's what I am known for working on. Ribosomes are incredibly ancient, and bacteria have ribosomes, and we have ribosomes, and the core of the ribosome is the same in bacteria and in humans.
And is it also the case that viruses can inject this is not a virus, by the way, it's a jellyfish, but viruses can inject their DNA, their code into our DNA, that we have remnants of viruses, DNA?
I think viruses probably evolved from very early life forms. So almost every species has viruses that will attack it. There are viruses that will attack bacteria. There are viruses that will attack archaea, which is another very old form of unicellular organisms. Yeast has viruses. All species have viruses. And so that means they evolved along with independently living cell forms. And viruses are basically small codes. They can't survive or reproduce without a host cell. And so they've learned how to be sort of parasitic and infect host cells and multiply inside the host cell and make copies and so on.
I just want to pause for a second to talk about the immortal jellyfish, because the immortal jellyfish seems to me really spectacular in that it seems to be, as there are a few other organisms like it, almost technically immortal. It doesn't show senescence. Its likelihood of dying does not increase over time.
Yeah, so the way biologists have defined mortality is that if you look at most species, the probability it will die increases exponentially with age. So for example, in humans, the likelihood that a 10-year-old will die, I mean of aging, not of, I don't mean in an accident or infection or something like that. The probability a 10-year-old will die is very, very small, tiny. And then as you get older, the likelihood keeps increasing. By the time you're in your late 90s, the chances you will die in the next year are 50% or so. So it increases exponentially. But in the case of the jellyfish, it turns out that the likelihood of its dying at any given time doesn't seem to increase with time. It seems to be steady. But I think what it is it's actually very slow. So if you really followed a jellyfish, eventually you would see, there's so many cases where biologists said, oh, this is a immortal species that doesn't show signs of mortality. And in fact, like the naked mole rat was a classic example. An old naked mole rat, or the Galapagos tortoise, they thought that was biologically immortal. But actually, they age. They look just like we humans do when we're old, and bad skin and bad eyesight and on the whole, and baldness and the whole works, So I think that's an issue. But the jellyfish does its thing by the fact that it has regenerative cells called stem cells. And they're distributed throughout so it can regenerate itself. And it's even bizarre that if a jellyfish gets injured or does something, it can actually go backwards in development, which we certainly don't do naturally, although there are people trying to do it with molecular biology tricks. And that is almost the equivalent of a butterfly turning into a caterpillar. That's the kind of thing I mean.
But in some sense, that jellyfish ceases to be, right? If it had a complex enough, it doesn't have a central nervous system, but it would be a new jellyfish.
And as I say, jellyfish do die. It's just that because they age so slowly, in the wild, they die of other reasons, starvation or predation, rather than aging.
Fascinating. So let's talk about the cell. Your book is very compelling story of really the biology of the cell is everything. And this is a famous photograph 51, which is the discovery essentially of the double helical nature of DNA.
Yeah. So, DNA is a double helix, and each strand contains a sequence of building blocks, and there are 4 types of building blocks. And the order of the building blocks is what specifies the information. And so you can think of DNA as a very, very long sentence that needs to be understood or decoded. And as we age, a number of things happen. So just to back up a little, sections of DNA are essentially units called genes. And typically what a gene has is information on how to make proteins, a particular protein. Each gene codes for a particular protein. And proteins are the workhorses of life. They really carry out all the reactions, the sensory reception, building the structure of the cell, and so on. And so you can have damage to the DNA, and that would be like corrupting the sentence in the DNA, and that then would lead to loss of function because you're not making the right protein anymore. Or you could modify the DNA so that you're changing the way in which proteins are made and when they're made or how much they're made, or maybe you're shutting off making proteins. So there are lots of ways in which you can change this very complicated program that our genes represent. And so that's one of the ways in which we age.
And you said that that's sort of overrated, though, too. I felt in your description of the book that, yes, DNA has wear and tear, but in some sense, there's no gene for dying. We're not programmed to die, you've said.
We're not programmed to die. There are genes that affect aging. For example, in worms, they've found mutant worms that live twice as long as wild-type worms. But if you took those mutant worms that live twice as long in a petri dish and put them in a petri dish with wild-type worms, within 2 or 3 generations, they're outcompeted, which means that they're at a disadvantage. There is some cost to living longer. Now, it turns out that the genes that make you live twice as long, those were not aging genes. They were genes for various growth pathways and so on. So they were selected for other reasons. The aging was just an unexpected consequence of this selection for growth and other processes. And this goes back to the evolutionary question. So evolution, as I said, doesn't care how long you live. It cares only that you can live long enough to grow up and produce offspring. And so it will select for things that optimize that process. And that means optimizing growth, maybe preventing cancer early in life. In many cases, those very same things cause aging later in life. But evolution doesn't care what happens later in life.
Do you think in some sense that most things simply died for other reasons, that nothing made it long enough to die from the negative effects of genes that were passed down?
And in fact, many, for example, why wasn't Huntington's disease selected against in humans? Or because for most of our history, we'd be dead before Huntington's disease manifested itself. And we would have, in any case, passed on our genes before it took effect. So there are many cases like that.
So there's another quite amazing discovery beyond just the sort of immortal gene, which I believe famously Richard Dawkins says this publicly. He called his influential book The Selfish Gene, but he sometimes wishes he had just called it the immortal gene. He would have gotten less grief, right? Less hate mail. If you want to be amused, you can watch Richard Dawkins reading his hate mail on broadcast. It's really quite hilarious. Beyond the discovery of the immortal gene is a discovery of stem cells, which strikes me as quite profound, which are cells that seem to be able to kind of reset the biological clock.
Yeah, so let's talk about resetting the biological clock first.
Okay.
So there is a biological process that resets the aging clock to 0. And it happens to us every time a child is born. So when a child is born, it's born from cells that it got from its parents who are adults. Nevertheless, the child is born at effectively age 0, or at least conceived effectively at age 0. So a child born to, say, a 40-year-old woman is not 20 years older than a child born to a 20-year-old woman. And so how does this happen? Well, you remember I said DNA can be modified as well as damaged. Well, these modifications can be erased, and that can then help bring the cell back to an earlier stage. Now, to your question about stem cells, what happens is you can start with a fertilized egg. A fertilized egg is like the ultimate stem cell. It's called totipotent. It means it can give rise to everything, including the placenta. this cell divides, and then part of it becomes placental cells, and the other part of it are pluripotent stem cells, which can give rise to everything else in the body, like skin and nervous system and blood and cartilage and bones and muscle, etc. And as this embryo develops, the stem cells become more and more specialized. So later on, you have stem cells, they can regenerate, for example, all of the cells of the blood system. They're called hematopoietic stem cells. Others can generate all of the cells of the nervous system. But the nervous system stem cells can't generate blood cells, so they've already specialized a bit. Now you get to the final stage, those cells can't generate, for example, a white blood cell can't generate other types of cells. It can only divide, and it can only divide a finite number of times, unlike a stem cell, which can divide almost indefinitely. And so stem cells are the cells that are involved in regenerating our tissues and organs. And you all know that if, for example, you bruise yourself, you can generate new skin. If you damage certain organs, you can generate, the organ will repair and regenerate. Others, like your heart, can't regenerate very well. That's why heart attacks are so dangerous. If you damage your heart muscle, you have a problem. And neurons, very few, there's very little turnover of neurons. Basically, they don't really regenerate so readily. Now, as we get older, our stem cells also decline because they also age. So they become smaller in number, poorer in quality. And so we're unable to also regenerate ourselves as readily as we could, unlike the immortal jellyfish, which is where stem cells are there throughout its existence.
It's sort of a strange, curious question. If the neurons did regenerate, would they reorganize our memories and our thoughts? Is there something about preserving the structure of the brain?
I think it would be very hard, because it's not a question of generating just new neurons. For example, let's say if you have Alzheimer's and your neurons die, when a neuron dies, it's not just the neuron that you care about, but it's all the connections it's made. So how would you regenerate a new cell and form those connections? I think, I point out that whereas people are doing reprogramming of cells, there are now tricks for making fully differentiated cells, like a skin cell, go backwards in development, something that doesn't happen naturally, and maybe even get back to being stem cells that can generate more of that tissue. And people have tried this there are 4 factors called Yamanaka factors. These are genes that code for proteins that regulate other genes, and called transcription factors. Anyway, these 4 factors can, when introduced in a cell, can make the cell go backwards. In fact, it may go all the way back to pluripotent cells, which is dangerous, because then you could have development in ways that you can't control. But what people ask is, can we make them go backwards just a little bit so that they can then regenerate more of that tissue? And it's been quite successful in mice. But going from there to a safe procedure that's useful is very hard. And getting back to your question, how you would regenerate the brain that has aged and become damaged, that would be very hard, because it's not simply a question of regenerating cells. It's also regenerating that network of connections.
Yes, be careful what you wish for. You could regenerate the brain and no longer be you anymore.
Right, you might not be anything. That's the problem.
Fascinating. I've also heard something about stem cells where women who've had pregnancies inherit the stem cells as well of the fetus, and that can protect them throughout their life. Is that something that we see, that stem cells that were from pregnancies are in women's bodies?
Well, for example, germline cells you can think of as the sort of almost the ultimate sort of stem cell, in that they're eventually going to produce fertilized eggs, which reproduce the entire organism. And it's true that our germline cells are very well protected. They have, I talked about DNA damage, so they're protected more against DNA damage. That's really interesting. They're also selected again for, so for example, a female, human is born with a very large number of oocytes, these precursors for eggs, germline cells, but loses a huge number of them. And that's because at every stage before it becomes an egg, there's a huge amount of selection going on. So anything defective is essentially eliminated. And even after the embryo is formed, there's selection going on of defective embryos are naturally aborted, and even within a developing embryo, defective cells are eliminated. So there's a lot of brutal selection, but also a lot of protection to ensure this apparent immortality of this germline.
So you've described to us the nucleus of the cell a little bit, and the DNA, and how the DNA is the kind of control center. You describe in your book the cell as almost like a city, and the organelles are these different factories or playing different roles in the city. And we have to talk about the ribosome, which is, of course, an area in which you've...
You had a picture of the cell as a city.
Oh, yeah, it's over here. Oh, there it is. Let's go back. This one?
Yeah, there.
Yes.
So for example, what do you have in a city? You have a government, which you can think of as a kind of command and control center. You have traffic. You have subways and buses that transport you, and trucks and so on that transport you. You have road networks, and you have electricity generating plants, power plants. Then you have, and increasingly so, you have border control that controls what comes in and out of the country, and or who comes in and out of the country. So the cell has all of these features, and so in some sense the cell is like a city, and the city has to work in a very coordinated way. All of these things have to work smoothly together, and almost in a seamless way. And you only notice that when, for example, in Margaret Thatcher's Britain, there's this massive strike of garbage, collectors, and there's all this piles of trash, building up on the streets, and the whole system started to break down, and so that's what happens if things don't work, and that is also part of aging. If things stop working, then the whole cell stops working. So it's more like a city. It's not like a machine, which is sort of designed thing with one part. Cities were by and large evolved. Of course we have city planning and so on, but historically cities just sort of evolved for various reasons. You
mentioned the garbage strike. I was really struck by your description of the organelle, the lysosome, which is like a garbage dumping facility.
The city has a garbage disposal system, very sophisticated garbage disposal system.
So you actually see it eating other organic matter, breaking it
down. So when proteins, it works at every level, from proteins to even very large organelles, or even infectious agents that have entered the cell and been detected. And what the cell does, it puts markers on them and then encapsulates them and takes them to this organelle called the lysosome. And in the lysosome, the whole thing is essentially broken down into its component pieces. So it's like a great recycling center, because then you can reuse those components to build more of the cell.
And so sometimes when certain cells stop functioning, you describe this as senescence, or which doesn't, when a cell goes into senescence, it's not dividing anymore, it still plays a role sometimes.
Yeah, so senescence evolved for good reasons. For example, if a cell has damaged DNA, you don't want that cell hanging around and doing its thing and dividing, because it might become cancerous, and that would be detrimental. you can easily afford to get rid of one cell because you have plenty of cells, and we won't even notice it. Millions of your cells are dying all the time. So the cell, life has evolved. So when a cell is stressed or damaged, there are a couple of signals. One of the signals could send the cell to a state called apoptosis, where it just dies, it commits suicide. But the other state is where it sends it into a state called senescence. In senescence, the cell doesn't die, but it can't divide in a normal way, and it's no longer functional. So if it's a skin cell or liver cell, it's not doing its normal thing. And it then also secretes inflammatory compounds. Why is it doing that? The inflammatory compounds are basically signals to the immune system to come there and repair the site and get rid of the cell. And because it might be the site of an infection or a wound, what caused the stress, it's not always clear. But whatever it is, you want to fix the problem. Now, as we get older, what happens is more and more of our cells are under stress, more and more of them are damaged, and so you start building up senescent cells. At the same time, our immune system is also aged, so it's not as efficient at clearing senescent cells. So you get this buildup of senescent cells, buildup of inflammation. Inflammation then causes organ damage and more senescent cells. And so it's a vicious cycle, and so it's a real problem with aging.
So is there research into clearing away these senescent cells? You say sometimes they're sent to go kill themselves,
Yeah,
and sometimes they're eaten by the lysosome, but sometimes they're just around causing problems.
Yeah, so there are people who are looking at ways to specifically target senescent cells. So senescent cells have certain pathways turned on, like non-apoptotic pathways, so that they don't die and they keep, in this senescent state. And so there are markers for senescent cells, and people have asked, can they target things that will go specifically and kill senescent cells? And that's been promising in animals, in animal trials. But of course, going from there to a therapy is tricky, because you have to make sure these compounds don't kill your normal cells, that they aren't toxic, they don't cause cancer over the long term, they don't have awful side effects. And it gets to a general, so that's an ongoing area, but there are these, they're called senolytics, these compounds that kill senescent cells. There are compounds in clinical trials already.
They are in human clinical trials.
Yeah, but the general problem with anti-aging therapeutics is the following. If you have serious cancer, and if you don't take any drugs, you're going to die in months or maybe even weeks. You will then be willing to take even horribly toxic cocktails of drugs in order to survive the cancer. You'll take radiation treatment, you'll have surgery to lop off organs. You'll do all that because the alternative is you'll die. But for anti-aging therapeutics, what you're asking is, you're asking a patient to take a drug for years to come in the hope that, a couple of decades down the line, they'll get an extra 10 years of healthy life. And that's a whole different proposition. So the bar on safety and efficacy is much different for anti-aging therapeutics.
Now, we have to talk a little bit about the ribosome. I believe I took this from your Nobel Prize lecture. You have said that the most important thing that the genome does, or that the genes do, is tell the cell how to create proteins. And proteins are everything. It's how we smell, taste, feel things.
Even antibodies that fight off viruses are proteins. And also we remember because of proteins. They're proteins that strengthen neuronal connections.
Which is quite a startling kind of revelation that it all can be boiled down to. The ribosome is the protein-generating machine.
Yes.
And this is actually an image that you created in the laboratory. Can you explain this a little bit to people?
Yeah,
Both the image and the ribosome.
So I told you that DNA is a string of letters that forms a sentence, and it's in units called genes. So let's say each gene represents a sentence, and DNA has a whole library of sentences. But that information is not read directly on the DNA, because DNA you can think of as an archival material. You don't want to mess around with it too much. And it's in the nucleus in our cells. So what the cell does is it takes a gene only when it's needed. It copies the information in that gene to an intermediate molecule called mRNA. Now, before 2020, nobody had heard of mRNA except for molecular biologists. And now all of you have had mRNA jabs in your arms. Well, not all of you. This is the United States, after all. You've had mRNA jabs that are supposed to vaccinate you against COVID. Well, what is that mRNA that you're injecting into yourself? That mRNA is simply the mRNA for the coronavirus gene for the spike protein. So what happens when you do that is the mRNA gets into your cells, into cells of your immune system, and then the ribosome latches onto that mRNA and makes the spike protein. The spike protein is then presented on the outside of these immune system cells, or fragments of the spike protein are, and then other immune system cells recognize it and say, hey, this is a foreign protein. I've not seen this before. And it starts mounting an immune reaction, makes antibodies, makes T cells, which will kill any cell that has this marker. And so then when you get infected with real coronavirus, the body sees the spike protein on the surface, but it's already prepared because its immune system has already been kind of pre-triggered. And so it's quick to get rid of it.
So quite amazing. The vaccine sends instructions for how to defend yourself in some sense.
Well, this vaccine, in the classical vaccine is you would make spike protein in cell culture or something, purify it, and then inject the spike protein into your system, and then your body would react to that spike protein and mount the same immune reaction. And there was a very good vaccine called Novavax, which did exactly that, which is a classical vaccine, worked very well, but they were third or fourth in the marketplace, and so they had very little uptake. With mRNA, the advantage is that if you get a new variant, you don't have to make new protein all over again. You can simply change the mRNA so that it codes for the new spike protein variant of, if you have new coronavirus variant. So you can get a booster that protects you against a new strain.
So I did want to talk about the research that's being done to try to do what you described in the opening as Plan A, the don't die version, right?
Yeah.
The don't die resistance to the finality of death.
There is a tech billionaire, Brian Johnson, who wears a T-shirt which says "Don't die." He spends $2 million a year on longevity of himself, and does all sorts of things to slow down his aging.
Well, is there any evidence that he's reversed course?
He looks very good. He's in his late 40s. He looks very good. But I should point out, my son, who's also in his late 40s, looks just as good without any of that stuff. So.
Well, you also mentioned in this area of research, anti-aging research or longevity research, somebody said, our goal is that everyone should die young after a long time.
Yeah, so...
Can you explain that sentiment?
Yeah, so this has to do with something called compression of morbidity. So normally we live healthy lives until we age, and then we start becoming less and less vigorous, more and more problems. I have osteoarthritis, I have pain in my joints, you might get dementia, you might get all sorts of issues. And so you get this long decline at the end. Now, it turns out that as life expectancy is increased, that period that we spend with morbidities, that is, with problems of old age, has not gotten less. In fact, it's remained almost the same as a fraction of our lives. So in terms of number of years, it's actually increased. In the old days, you got old, you'd get pneumonia, you'd immediately die. You wouldn't have this long sustained decline. And so this idea of compression or morbidity is, a lot of aging researchers say, and by say, I don't mean that the researchers are aging. When I say that, I mean longevity researchers. So these people basically say that we're going to increase health span. So we're going to keep you healthy for as long as possible and reduce that period of decline. And that idea of that reduction is called compression of morbidity. That's the term that they apply to it. And the question is compression of morbidity actually possible? Because almost every advance that has increased life expectancy, for example, improvements in cancer treatment, diabetes, heart disease, all have increased our life expectancy, but they've also increased that period of decline. It's not shortened that period of decline. And there's a poem called The One-Horse Open Shay by Oliver Wendell Holmes, which is quoted in the first paper that coined this term, compression or morbidity. Now, a shay is a carriage for one or two people. And this wonderful one-horse open shay was constructed so all its parts would wear out at the same time, at the same rate. So this farmer was riding along on his perfectly good shay and suddenly found himself on the ground surrounded by a heap of debris because the whole thing just disintegrated all at once. And that's sort of what we're asking for humans, that you live very healthily. And this quote that you said, we want to die young after a long time, was by Rick Klausner, who's the chief scientist of Altos Labs, which is one of the big sort of billion-dollar investments in anti-aging. And a lot of tech billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Yuri Milner have invested in it. And so the question is, if you're young, why would you suddenly die? So that's the conundrum that they haven't quite explained. But I should point out that these supercentenarians, that's a term you used for people who live over 110, many of them live extraordinarily healthy lives and then suddenly decline and die. So there are at least some individuals who have achieved compression of morbidity, but we don't know if these supercentenarians have some general lessons for the rest of us. For example, they may have a particular combination of genes and life history and pure luck that allowed them to live that long and live healthily. They may have escaped various infections and just not got cancer purely by chance or some combination of their genes and lifestyle. It's not clear what lessons we can learn from them. There may be things that we can, but it's not yet completely clear.
My bubby was like that. She was 96. She called me to tell me she quit smoking. Yeah. And that she was doing Meals on Wheels for old people.
Yeah.
The family joke was, how old are they, bubby? And then she lived alone, argued about politics, and lived to be 101. Yeah. Just was exactly what you described. She was ready. Yeah. She was like, I'm done. So it's very intriguing, this idea that who's going to want to die at the peak of fitness,
right,
if they're told that it's a sudden switch off.
Or really anything. There's an old joke in the aging field, which is who would want to live to be 100, and it's someone who's 99. you know.
Right, exactly. So well, let's talk a little bit about protocols, because I know a lot of people want to hear what, regardless of all the warnings and the philosophical realities, what is being done in research. And one of the things that's been very popular among the people that you're describing who want to die young after a very long time, one of the things that's become very popular is caloric restriction, and how there's evidence that actually that kind of stress leads to longevity in certain animal subjects.
So there have been studies done in a variety of animals, all the way from even small single-cell animals like yeast, through flies and worms and mice, and even chimpanzees or monkeys anyway. So you can have a whole range of animals. And in all those cases, they found that if you take a group of animals and feed one group all they can eat, that's called an ad libitum diet. They can eat as much as they want of this food you give them. And the other group gets just enough food for them to live, not starve, so they don't decline in weight, but they have enough calories and nutrients, vitamins and micronutrients, to live indefinitely. It turns out that the calorically restricted animals are often healthier and live somewhat longer than the control group. And so this leads to the idea that maybe caloric restriction does something to our aging process. Now, there is one caveat, and one of the sort of fathers of aging research, Leonard Hayflick, who discovered cellular senescence, he complained that these studies just show that an all-you-can-eat diet is bad for you. You know,
right.
because there was another monkey trial where they didn't feed such an unhealthy diet to the control group, and there the differences weren't as striking as a different monkey trial where they give the control group a rich all-you-can-eat diet. So anyway, but no matter what, it does mean that the level of calories you consume does have an effect on aging. And people have figured out at least some of the pathways that are affected by caloric restriction. Now, caloric restriction is very hard to do. You know,
yeah, I'm not into it. Yeah.
People who are in calorically restricted diets feel hungry all the time. They're cold. They often have loss of libido. So, you know, you want to ask, you know, what is the purpose of life, you know?
You better be sure about those scientific studies, is all I'm saying.
Yeah. So people have asked, is there a way to cheat the system? And the idea is, could you maybe interfere with pathways that are affected by caloric restriction that might mimic the effects of caloric restriction? And one of the darling drugs of the anti-aging community is rapamycin, which inhibits a pathway called the TOR pathway, which also senses nutrients, and so reducing calories has a similar effect as this drug rapamycin. But rapamycin is also an immunosuppressor. That's why it was approved as a drug. And it was, you know, given to organ transplant recipients to prevent rejection of a foreign graft. So whether you would want to give that sort of drug for over a long period and it has other side effects, by the way. So would you take rapamycin for a long period in order to age perhaps more slowly or maybe a bit more healthily? You know, it's not clear. I personally wouldn't, but I can tell you there are a lot of longevity researchers who are quietly taking rapamycin on the side as an off-target prescription. So I guess they think the controlled trials will take too long, and they're aging in the meanwhile, and they don't want it to age. So they feel that the data are good enough for them. I think this just shows that science is a very rational endeavor, but scientists are humans and therefore not completely rational.
In this research, there has, as you warn, there have also been examples of sort of snake oil, things that were touted, even companies that were exchanged with hundreds of millions of dollars at stake, where none of it actually played out. And there's a sort of warning about things like, was it sirtuins and maybe resveratrol?
Sirtuins came out of perfectly legitimate research, and in fact, many of those papers, the original papers probably did show the effect. Sirtuins are proteins, they're enzymes that modify they add acetyl groups to other proteins. And there was this idea that maybe sirtuins are involved in aging. But then other studies contradicted those first studies. Then there was an idea that resveratrol, an ingredient of red wine, would activate sirtuins. And then it was shown that actually the report on activation had to do with a particular way in which they measured activation, which turned out to be an artifact. So in many ways, but sirtuins, the whole concept was sold to GlaxoSmithKline for $750 million. And after many years of work, follow-up work, GlaxoSmithKline basically shut down that division. And so, most of the aging community does not believe in that sort of primary role for sirtuins. But I should tell you that many of the original investigators, and some of them are quite famous, still believe in sirtuins. And I like to joke that this is, Max Planck was a very famous physicist. And he said that people don't discard false ideas and adopt new ideas because they change their mind. Scientists don't do that. Rather, scientists just die, and a new generation,
not if they can help it,
looks at the data more objectively and moves on. And so the short version of that statement is science advances one funeral at a time.
But a lot of the research you think is legitimate. And
Sorry?
A lot of the research you think is legitimate. And
quite a lot of it is based on very solid science. For example, reprogramming of stem cells, very promising, but not around the corner yet, because of it. Going from there to being able to have effective and safe therapy for humans that has predictable outcomes, that's quite hard. Same with caloric restriction. Rapamycin does work, but can you find a safer version? Or maybe can you find a dose for rapamycin that has the benefits without the unwanted side effects? So, and metformin is another drug, which is somewhat, evidence on metformin is mixed. Some say that it actually does make you live longer and healthier. Others say that it doesn't make much of a difference. And you need large-scale trials on healthy people, not on diabetics who have to take metformin. So there are lots of things that have a sound scientific basis, but they need to be developed, like senolytics, these senescent cell targeting, or factors in blood. It turns out that if you connect an old and a young rat, so that their blood systems are exchanged, then the old rat benefits from the blood from the young rat, and the young rat actually deteriorates or suffers from the blood of the old rat. And so this means there are markers, there are factors in blood that change with age, and that's a legitimate field of research. But when you talk about charlatans, it turned out that right from the time when these scientists at Stanford published their first finding, they started getting creepy phone calls from rich people about where could they get blood. And companies started sprouting up, getting blood from young donors and then selling them up at some huge markup to rich old people. And of course, these transfusions had really, almost no effect, because, it's not the same as connecting to animals all the time. And also, you need to know what these factors are and how they work and how to administer them. And that's a long-range research project.
I'm conscious of the time, and I want to give people a chance to ask questions. But before I do, I want to kind of end on your own sort of philosophical disposition towards this. You also quote in your book Barbara Ehrenreich, who experimented with living in poverty. It was a very interesting
Oh, it's a
writer.
brilliant book. I remember that.
Yeah, and you quote this line, which I'm going to shorten drastically, where she says, "You can think of living as a temporary interruption of an eternity of personal non-existence," right?
Right.
Which is, there's 14 billion years before we were born, and there will be many billion years after we die.
You didn't exist for an infinite period, and then you exist for a short time, and then again you don't exist. And that's one way to view it. And other people have said that, for example, Mario Llosa Vargas, the Peruvian novelist, he said that an immortal life would be just horrible because you would lose all of the incentives of life if you knew that you just had infinite time to do whatever you wanted. These are all philosophical, but I have to say the reality is, if you ask somebody, how do you feel about a finite life? They say, oh yeah, it's fine. If you ask them, would you like to die next year? How about next year? They say, no, we don't want to die next year. And so if somebody came to you with a pill and said, look, this pill will make you live an extra healthy 10 years, most of us would take it. I mean, I'm taking statins and high blood pressure medicines. Why am I doing that? So that I can stay healthier and potentially live longer. So I think human nature is to want to exist, because existence is all we know, and we fear that loss of existence.
Beautiful moment. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Venki Ramakrishnan.
At 96, I asked my mother how old she felt inside. And she said, after thinking for a little while, she said, not yet born yet. At 101, she left her body behind. What about the spirit, the energy that Janna's mother lived to 101?
Grandmother. Yeah.
Sorry.
That's right.
What is that energy that keeps us running, keeps us alive, keeps us excited?
There are two interesting sociological observations about death. One is that elderly people who have a community, they have a network of friends, of relatives or family, have connected to the community in general, they have a lower mortality rate. A second is that older people with a sense of purpose in life tend to have a lower mortality rate. And so if they have some reason for wanting to live, because they have a purpose, they want to do something, it could even be a hobby, it could be volunteering, it could be anything. Those people somehow seem to live longer. Whether that's just a correlation or a cause, we don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Next question.
Thank you for the excellent conversation. You often hear anecdotes of people being aware of their own morbidity. So, grandma wakes up one day and says, today's the day, and later that day she dies. Or people who are on their deathbed kind of letting go and kind of dying shortly thereafter. Is there any scientific understanding of people's kind of mental connection or awareness with their death, or is this all just kind of happenstance?
I think, the letting go, I'm not sure letting go actually is causing them to die. Rather, it may be that their body has reached a certain stage, of suffering or decay, that their brain has eventually accepted the signals from the rest of the body and said, okay, this is it. And so we may be mixing up cause and effect there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I keep on getting caught in this conversation with a dear friend of mine. And I think he does this to annoy me, but he talks about this idea of the simulation and that we're all stuck in this thing. And I hope you don't agree with that. And I kind of lose my cool when I talk to him about this.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could supply me with some arguments.
Well, I think, this whole simulation, maybe people have seen The Matrix too often, and so they think life is a simulation. This is an old philosophical paradox, like how do we know this is the real world and we're not in some sort of simulation of some other thing? And, I don't buy it, but there's no real logical way to refute it. And so I don't think of it as science in that sense, because science is basically you have to have a hypothesis that you can refute. So this is a domain of either sophomores in college or philosophers.
I have to say, I think that you might be able to make a rational argument, which is, my computer's never gone that long without crashing. And I never get a 404 not found page, in reality. And in fact, there are mathematical proofs that you cannot make a bug-free code. So if we were in a simulation, it would have to have bugs, unless it's not guided by mathematics, in which case we're not really in the realm of anything as interesting as even The Matrix, I think.
I think people are pretty buggy. But thank you.
Quick question. Since evolution wants us to live long enough to reproduce and have our genes carried, and most everybody who does that is going to do that, say, by the age of 40, why do we live as long as we do? Why aren't we all dying at 40?
Yeah, that's a slight paradox, but there may be two reasons for that. One is that about 40,000 years ago, our lifespan dramatically increased for reasons that are not completely understood. And so we may have evolved a lifespan so we may really have a lifespan that goes well beyond our reproductive period because of that. And it relates more to women than to men, because women go through menopause, and so they live long after they can reproduce. Men actually can reproduce not quite until death, but for a much longer time. In that sense, they're more like most other species.
And you were saying that even whales can reproduce towards females, can reproduce towards
Well, orca whales are one of the few other species that go through human-like menopause, where the female, stops having the ability to reproduce and lives much longer. And there are all kinds of theories about it.
The good grandmother theory.
Grandmother theory, the mother theory. Mother hypothesis is you have to live long enough until your youngest child has grown up to be able to reproduce. Otherwise, it doesn't really count. And the grandmother hypothesis is that it's better for you to stick around and help your grandchildren survive than for you to continue to have babies. But evolutionary biologists don't really buy at least the grandmother hypothesis. And so, it could simply be that evolution hasn't had a time to catch up with this increase in lifespan.
But social species there is something about the organization of social species that isn't just the survival of the individual, at least,
Yeah, but group selection doesn't really work out, except group selection is where you evolve for, say, some trait that helps the group as a whole, not necessarily the individual. And that, mathematicians have shown, only works for groups that are extremely related genetically, like ants, eusocial species, like ants or bees.
Naked mole rats, which you mentioned. Naked mole rats, which you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So it doesn't really work for humans, and there are reasons for that, because there's this thing called cheaters, and if you have a mutation that goes against the benefits you but not the group, it'll be selected for eventually.
Last question, please.
Hello, thank you both for your insight. I was curious about your opinions on psychedelics, and I know people have been using them for thousands of years, and I was wondering from like a biological and evolutionary standpoint, like why do you think they're here, and
Why? What? Sorry.
About psychedelics. Psychedelics like,
Yeah.
you know, help me out here, people. Ayahuasca, mushrooms,
Yeah, so what about
psilocybin. If you think that there is a reason why human beings have a relationship with psychedelics.
Oh,
Naturally.
I don't think that, I'm not sure that has that much to do with aging or death. I think it's simply, they're able to have sensory experiences that we don't normally experience has always been a draw, I think, in many cultures. And so that may explain the reason that psychedelics have been around for such a long time.
Venki, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.